Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for your patience. We've had quite a bit of technical difficulties. Things were working before too, but when it was time to go live, we were having some trouble. So I'm hoping that you were able to read the chat and you do have a paper and pen and you've already begun jotting down your top 3 to 5 reasons why students succeed in college. So with that, we're just going to go ahead and get started. And just go to the outline slide. Let me share. All right, and my name is Faye Howard. I am the Assistant Dean for Upper Level Initiatives at the University of South Florida, and I'm presenting with my colleague, Dr. Melissa Irvin, and she will introduce herself in just a bit. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Just an overview of what we're going to go over today. Pretty much part 1, which is my session, we're going to be addressing shifts in mindset and really examining a couple of things that will really help guide the way that you look at becoming a student-ready college, and most importantly, how you look at the data to become a student-ready college. So we're going to go ahead and get started with bias. All right, so we're all familiar with this term, but we're going to take a little bit of a deep dive today. So you may have seen this picture before in the right hand of the slide. Now, some of you may see a young woman, some of you may see an older woman, some of you may be able to see it kind of interchangeably because you've seen it so much. I'm one of those folks that I can really see the old woman and the younger woman pretty much at the same time, just depending on how I shift my eyes. But one of those things, it really does boil down to bias. It is kind of our preconceived notions that we have, and it's not really based in rationality. It's just some of the things that we have, whether we're in favor of one thing or against another. And these can be learned or they can be innate. All right, let's take some time to go over implicit bias. So implicit bias, that really refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understandings, actions, decisions in a very unconscious manner. So we're not purposefully or taking the time to make a decision about how we think about something when it's implicit bias. And it goes hand in hand with unconscious bias. You know, those stereotypes that are formed, the things that we hold to be true. And this really starts, believe it or not, from very young ages. If you can recall back, if you were educated in the US, one of the things that was very common in kindergarten and elementary school, we played lots of games when it comes to grouping things, you know, fruits and vegetables, which ones belong, which ones do not. And, you know, we're not consciously trying to determine grouping things that are alike together, but it's part of the learning process, especially in American education. You know, when we're learning about what is safe and what's not, when you're teaching your children or how you recall how you were taught, you know, sometimes we talk to children about, you know, very good things, you know, make sure you look both ways before you cross the street. But what are we doing when we go through a certain neighborhood and we're locking our doors? What does that neighborhood look like? What do the people who live there look like? And those type of things are impressed upon us at a very young age that lead to these unconscious biases that we tend to have. If you think about our media as well, you know, when you tend to watch the news, are you seeing a particular type of person? Are the crimes that are being shown generally being committed by people of color? There's also quite a bit of research out there when it looks at newspaper clippings, depending on who actually committed a crime, what the news heading says. All of those types of things start to take, you know, sketch a memory in our brains, and it really leads to some of the unconscious bias and implicit bias that we have. I just want to take a little bit of time on implicit bias for a moment. And you have a system 1 and system 2 processing that we learn these different types of biases. So it's an accepted framework of understanding our mental processing. In system 1, this really handles the outside of our conscious. You know, we really don't have time to think about it. It's automated and it's fast, often operating implicitly. And then the system 2 is when we have the time to actually take some time to think through what something means and why we've come to that particular conclusion. All right, so implicit bias. Once again, it may not align with your explicit beliefs or your stated intentions. It's just one of those things where I said before, it just comes to your mind very quickly and you're not always thinking about it. Well-intentioned, but you may produce inequitable outcomes depending on the different groups. We're going to spend a little bit of time breaking down why some of that can happen. And then, of course, there's a tremendous impact on decision-making with a lack of awareness. You'll find this not only within our institutions of higher education, but of course in different organizations and just in society as a whole. But you have to remember that robust associations in System 1 processing allow for a vast range of implicit bias and implications for individuals. Okay, so still staying on this just a little bit with this System 1 processing, because remember, that's the one that's quick and fast. We don't often have the time to process it. And even the environment that we find ourselves in today with all the changes that we've had to make due to COVID-19 and just some of the extra pressures that we didn't have prior to COVID-19, there's been lots of decisions that have had to be made very quickly and fast. We really haven't had the time to process. And this is like a perfect storm of where implicit bias really begins to show its face. You know, if you have any one of these areas where, you know, you get ambiguous or incomplete information, if you can recall the early days of what was going on, we weren't quite sure of how long this would last. I'm pretty sure if we had a magic ball, none of us could have thought that, you know, 6 months down the road, we still be, for many of us, you know, in this new normal. And there's time constraints. Decisions have to be made. We don't have the time to really think through what are the best decisions. We need to make a decision fast. And then when we're compromised, meaning we're tired or fatigued or we're frustrated, we've got a lot going on. That's pretty much all today. You take COVID out of the equation and you look at the social injustice that's going on, how it disproportionately has impacted people of color, particularly our Latino and our Black population. All of these things really help increase the chances for implicit bias occurring. So how can you address it? Since we know that it occurs, and right now we have the kind of the perfect situation for it to take place. So there's a couple things that you can do. You want to be aware of your biases. That's one of the first things that you want to do. An example that I like to use when I talk about this, some years ago, it's very common now, but I'd say probably about a good, like 15 years ago, when I was in positions to review people for jobs, I would always make sure that I told the search committee, you know, I'm letting you all know, I know this about myself. I have tended to have a bias against those that earn their credentialing online as opposed to those who went to a brick and mortar school. And I absolutely know that you can get a solid education online as opposed to brick and mortar, but it's just one of those things that was ingrained in me when I was growing up that, you know, you don't want to go to an online school. So one of those things is just to be aware of your own bias, let the people around you know about it so that they can provide checks and balances so you're not utilizing your own implicit bias in your decision making. So you, first of all, you just want to be aware of it. A couple of things that you want to keep in mind for some conditions to really help work on that implicit bias is kind of equalize the status within the situation. Depending on what it is, it can vary. But this comes down to the people that you're working with and the groups that you surround yourself with. Cooperative setting, that's not always possible, but these are the things that you want to strive for, and then make sure that everybody's working toward a common goal to counteract this. One of the things that you can check as well, if you're interested, there's a implicit association test known as IAT. It actually was developed in 1998. It's a Harvard project. You can go online and check it. It's actually free. That's something as well that you could just get a good check on kind of where you fall when it comes to your biases. And it really takes a look at the strength of the associations that you have between a wide range of things. Okay. Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is something that we have to be very careful about, just because, generally speaking, it kind of feels really good when you're able to say, I told you so. If you ever been in a situation where you have been able to kind of forecast an outcome, that's where that confirmation bias comes from. And it also takes, one of the things that I have learned as well, the research has shown us if you already have some preconceived notions or ideas, when research is presented, very valid research, followed the scientific methodology, peer reviewed, all of the things that you would need to accept it as something that would be useful for decision making. What we tend to do is provide more scrutiny to that type of data that comes out because it counteracts what we believe to be true. So we have to be careful of that. And then also on the opposite side, when we're getting data or research or literature or things like that, where we don't have the validity that it should have, and it's not going by the scientific methodology, hasn't been validated, it's not peer reviewed, and we're quick to jump on it where it may be more of an opinion piece because it actually confirms what we believe to be true. So we have to be careful of that. That's just one of the things in our learning and our processing. It's something that we enjoy, whether it's, you're more boisterous about it or you're more meek about it. There is a kind of confirmation and an overall feeling of, it just feels good to be right. So you just have to be careful about that. Be careful of your confirmation bias. I told you earlier to take out a pen and paper. So just really quickly, what I'd like you to do, just take a moment. So whomever you report to, or any task force that's on your campus, any work group, any committee, just think about that. And you are the project manager of this group. So I want you to think about the people that you actually work with, real names, real people. This is just for you to see. And you've been given a charge. So what you have to do, they've told you, you need to pull a team together. And I really need you to work on addressing student success, for example. And I want to make sure that we're doing this in a way that's going to serve all of our students. So it's very broad, and for a reason it's very broad. I want you to just take a moment and think about your top 6 people that you're going to ask to join your team. And remember, these have to be real people that you work with. I want you to write down those 6 people. And we'll just take about a minute for you to go through that. Okay, so you should just be wrapping up with the 6 people you've identified that are on your campus. And we're going to go back to the presentation. Okay, so now that you have your 6 people, I want you to think about these different layers in your circle of trust. So it's up to you how many people you're going to put in each one of these layers. So in that highest level, can you put in there where it should show red on your screen, where the bullseye is, the folks that you have on your team that you trust the most? And trust defined as you would define it. That's on the team that you've assembled to address this project, initiative, charge. Who's in that highest level bullseye in that circle of trust, the red one? And then same thing with the outer circle, the next layer, that inner circle. Maybe I know for myself, I definitely have my go-to people that I can trust with information and say the things that you would often tend to say after the meeting. Yeah, I don't know if you have those. We have those. We have meetings after the meeting where there's things that are discussed publicly, and then you have a couple of people or maybe only one other person that you're able to share kind of your true thoughts and feelings about how things are. For those people, for me, they go in my highest level. That's in the bullseye. Then you also have the next layer, which is your inner circle. Those people that you can share a great deal with, you can rely on them to get some work done. That you selected them for your team. They're not in the highest level, but you definitely trust them, but perhaps you might not share everything. And then there's the outer circle of folks. These are people that you respect and know that they will be able to get the job done, but perhaps you're not sharing all of those details about things with the folks that are in the outer circle. So just kind of plot that. Make sure you make a note of that, of who is where. So you've got the folks in the highest level of trust in your circle of trust, then that second inner layer, which is that yellow, and then the third one, which is the blue. So that should be fairly quickly that you plotted all that you have all those down. So just make sure you kind of keep track of that. If you just want to put, H for the highest, and then I for those that are in the inner, and then O for those that are in the outer circle. So now that you have all of that, now I want you to take some time and think about this chart here and kind of plot the names out. So let's say if I worked at your school and I was on your list of 6 people, and I happen to be in your highest level of trust. You would, Faye Howard, is English her first language? Yes, English actually is my first language. Was I born in the US? Yes, I was actually born in the US. You'd write down my highest level of education, my race and ethnicity, my gender, my age range, sexual orientation if you happen to know it, and then my faith if you happen to know it. And I'd like you to do that for all of the 6 people. And this is for you, remember. And when I've done this activity before, it's been very surprising to people to see just how homogeneous the groups are that they actually put together when they have to sit and think about the people that they're bringing into the conversation. And this is very important in all of the work that we do, but it's especially important when you're trying to become a college-ready campus, and also when you're talking about data and decision-making. So this is more of an exercise for you and for self-reflection, but it really works very well to hold up a mirror to our actions in the way that we work within our institutions of higher learning. Okay, couple of things that I want to go over as well before we transition over to my colleague. So transformative learning, it's one of the things that can be done on our campuses. It's very difficult work. It doesn't happen overnight. Being truthful and honest with you, this is work that can take up to months and sometimes even boil over into, say, a year-long process, perhaps even more. But really, it's about constructing newer or revised interpretation of meaning of one's experience to guide actions. That means that the people around the room, you acknowledge that they have different experiences, that our students have different experiences, and it's important to utilize those to guide our actions. It also requires that we critically reflect on the assumptions that are underlying our intentions, our values, and our beliefs. This really rings true with the term that I'm not happy about, but it's used quite often in higher education, is our students at risk. If you think about that, what are the underlying assumptions that we're putting on our students as they walk through the door? What are the underlying assumptions that we're putting on our students of color, our students that are in different socioeconomic statuses? And for us to really do transformative learning correctly, we really have to expand our consciousness and really expand our basic views of the world. And that takes time. That's why I said this is work that is not completed very quickly with kind of a checklist task item type of thing. And it doesn't happen. This isn't anything that's going to be, oh, wow, we just got into a room and we did some great transformative learning. It doesn't happen that way. This is very intentional. You have to set out to do this type of work. It's a directed process. And it's something that often the work that we have doesn't permit us the time to do this. But it can take place, and it's very important in becoming a student-ready college. A couple of things that I just wanted to talk about that I won't get into too much detail for the sake of time is that there are transformative multicultural initiatives that you can be working on your campuses. Once again, same thing, this takes time. But if you think about any type of program or strategies that really promote the skill and development to better manage institutions, community, your personnel, all of that. But you come to it with a multicultural lens and thinking about it in terms of multicultural initiatives. Many of us are really searching for effective ways to improve our underrepresented and minority student populations. And we're not thinking about it through a multicultural lens or through doing multicultural practices. So we have to think about ways that do not perpetuate marginalizing people who are underrepresented or who are identified as minority populations within our institutions. And just remember that transformative multicultural initiatives, it really puts the work at the center instead of at the margins of everything that you're trying to do. So anytime that you get a charge or initiative and it's on the outside, meaning you've kind of come up with the entire plan, and then at the end, maybe perhaps it's you're the person in the meeting and you're raising your hand and saying, well, wait a minute, what about this particular population? Wait a minute, what does this mean for this particular program? It really has to be at the center, and it can't be an afterthought for true transformative multicultural initiative programming to work. One of the things, it's probably just as small on your screen, but there is a book that will help you guide this type of work. And one of the things that I found very beneficial is the authentic action-oriented framing for environmental shifts. And this means that we're no longer trying to do the incremental change on our campuses, but we're truly doing what's needed to do an environmental shift and to frame the way that we have our power structures. We're going to challenge unfair practices, unfair policies. We're going to take the time to identify and explore the areas that are creating the inequities among our student population. And what you'll often find is that it's not one or the other. The inequities is a campus-wide issue. It's a total issue where you're not just going to find it in the student population, you're often going to find it in our faculty, in our staff, in our administrators. It's not just this kind of one thing. So if you have some time, the book, it can be found on Amazon and in lots of other sites. It's definitely something to take a look at. But this AAFES method, it really guides participants through the process of critical reflection. And it really is about transforming into humanizing environments and nurturing a cultural setting where people within it can be more fully human, regardless of their status. All right, a couple of things here that I want to briefly go over with you. So how do we break down the current inequitable structure? A couple of steps that you can think about, beginning with fundamental beginnings of deconstruction. So talk about your personal identities. You have to look at your campus, look at what's in place, and really recognize those that are privileged and those that are marginalized. These conversations can be very difficult to have because truthfully, no matter what layer you find yourself in, even myself, I identify as a Black woman, I'm first generation. Even within that group of marginalization, I still have privilege. So you really have to work out all of that in certain spaces. You know, I'm a college educated person. That puts me in a level of privilege that folks that don't have a college education don't get the benefits of. So that really takes self-reflection and honesty. And then operating modes, your behaviors and your attitudes, not just your own, but those of your campus community. And being able to not just say it, but find the evidence to back it up. The social and institutional conditions. This is one of the ones that I'd like to talk about the most when we have more time. Dr. Irvin and I did this as a pre-conference, and we were able to dig into this a little bit more. But the policies and the practices that are in place often are places where perhaps it wasn't intentional, but really create the inequities that we find on our campuses when it comes to data, when it comes to providing student-ready campuses. And not only does it provide the foundation of inequity, it allows it to exacerbate. Instead of us closing the gap, it actually widens it, because this is a difficult one that we'd rather not touch. We'd rather build a program around it to fix it and actually fix the structure and the policy that created it in the first place. This is a very multi-layered approach, really recognizes an all-campus, all-hands-on-deck ability for us to really work together and resolve our concerns. Another thing to keep in mind is the deficit model of thinking. I'm pretty sure that you're not hearing this for the first time, but it is important to mention it, that the deficit model is a tendency to focus on weakness, areas of improvement, deficiencies, what's wrong, instead of utilizing those things that are right. When I talk about this in terms to help people understand the deficit model, when it comes to our students, especially those that that the literature even identifies as at risk, we talk about those students who are first generation, who have lower socioeconomic status, a wide range of things that we, depending on what school district they went to, what their standardized test scores were, all of these things that we are, before we even meet them, they're just an application, and we already stick them in a category of high risk. And we don't take the time to get to know the student and recognize the fact that, okay, well, perhaps this student didn't have college-educated parents, but let's look at all of the things that they've been able to accomplish despite the circumstances that many of us would say would lead them down a different path as opposed to one that led them to college. We don't look at the things that they have done right and the things that they have done well to use that as a strength. Often with the deficit model of thinking as well, it's a mindset where, say, for example, you have students who have a wide range when it comes to the courses. Some courses they do really well, some courses they're doing very poorly in. And one of the first conversations you'd want to have is, okay, let's talk about the C or the D or the F. Instead of recognizing where they did the A or the D, and say, can you talk to me about your performance in this class? What'd you do? How did you perform? What are some of the things that you were able to accomplish? Now let's look at leveraging that to help in this particular area where the outcome isn't exactly what you wanted it to be. Good way to address deficit model thinking is, of course, mindset, but within the context of this conference and the work that we're trying to convey today, you have to recognize that all of our institutions are bureaucratic structures, and there's certain things that are innate and baked in bureaucratic structures that really lead us to deficit model thinking, and that we may not even be aware of it. So just a couple of components of bureaucratic structures, and I make the strong argument that institutions of higher learning are indeed just that. And not only does it impact the way that we work, but it impacts the way we use data, it impacts the way that we interact with students, and it truly does prevent us becoming student-ready campuses to meet the students that come to us where they are, instead of making them adjust to our current practices. So just these 6 areas: specialization, hierarchical authority, rules and regulations, technical competence, impersonality, and formal written communication. We check all of those boxes, no matter if you're at a community college, for-profit college, public college, technical, all of those things exist. And and I make that point because we're innate to structures that promote biases. The bias is baked in. So that's something that you have to come to terms with, knowing that the bias is baked in. So we have to work even harder to unveil those areas. So one of the things that you may not be as familiar with, some of you, others might be, when it comes to the impersonality piece, it's the attempt by large organizations to protect their members. So this doesn't really mean that each individual is trying to protect what their colleagues are doing or their staff is doing or their team is doing. It means you're protecting the mission by any means necessary. So the USF, I'll use my own school as a sample, as an example. We're in a performance-based funding state. So you have to admit that many of the decisions we make go back to making sure that we meet our metrics so that we are going to get rewarded for the metrics that we meet in a performance-based state. So by any means necessary, there's things that all of us know we're not going to compromise. And that's where that impersonality comes from. So it may be different for each school, but I'm sure that many of you can just think of some of the things that won't be compromised no matter what, because this has to get done. That's where that impersonality comes from, just to clarify if that wasn't as familiar to you. But I just want to leave you with the fact that the bias is baked in. It makes our jobs much more difficult because we have to unveil them to address them. And coming to a close here with my section, the mindset part of it is, this goes back to what I asked you to jot down before, becoming a student-ready college. And if you have the growth mindset, you really take on the belief that things can be developed through hard work, learning, and feedback. There isn't anything that's set, no matter how bleak it looks. You have to have this mindset and outlook in order to move forward and move past some of the biases that currently exist. You can improve it, you can address it. It takes time, it takes effort, but most importantly, it takes the ability to say that you're going to do this, and it's not just going to happen. It has to be something that you're willing to tackle and tackle head on. And just to wrap things up, oh, sorry, I'm moving ahead. So that's it for my section. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Irwin. That was my slide.
Hello, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to take over and just give you a couple of guiding questions, and then we're going to take about a 4 to 5 minute break. We know this is a 2-hour presentation, and we want to make sure that you get up and move so that your mind can stay alert and engaged and fresh. And then when you come back from that 5-minute break, I'm going to dig in a lot deeper to this definition of a student-ready college and what the use of data means in helping you prepare to create a student-ready college and the risks that are involved in that as it relates to data usage and bias. So a couple of guiding questions here before we go into break. Looking at what your campus values is an essential part of becoming a student-ready college. So how can campus values support an effort to make the campus ready for students? As my colleague, Dr. Howard said, knowing what the students bring to the table, looking at it from a strengths-based approach, and then meeting the students where they are is a key component to becoming student-ready. How do campuses engage with the whole community and governance in this effort? We're going to talk some about governance and how that connects to data, but think back to that circle of trust exercise that you just did. How are you engaging your community? In what ways do you engage the community in ways that you're actively addressing how bias can affect your decision making? And then we'll dig into what role data plays in helping you address that bias. And then finally, in that third question, think about how do you make a case for change based on this vision? How do you get that governance group together? How do you use data to create a vision that says, you know what, transforming the way that we work with students to create a lens where we become student ready is urgent. It's something we all have a valued and vested interest in, and it is a powerful tool in helping us achieve our goals. So as we move into the break, take time to sort of process through those pieces of becoming a student-ready college. I'm going to give you that 5 minutes, and then we'll jump right back into talking specifically about the use of data as it relates to bias and this definition of being student-ready. If you have any questions or anything you want to go ahead and drop in the chat, we will review those during the break so that we'll be ready to address those. And we'll also have time left at the end of the session to address questions. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I hope you're able to stretch your arms and stretch your legs and process all of the great foundational information that my colleague, Dr. Howard, shared with you. Just as a reminder, my name is Dr. Melissa Irvin. I am an Assistant Dean of Advising and Analytics at the University of South Florida. For the second half of our presentation today, I'm going to use all of the information that Dr. Howard shared with us about deficit thinking, about mindset, and about bias to understand how our use of data is influenced by our biases and how we can actually start thinking about using it differently to not only reduce the negative impact of bias, but start to use data as a tool to make us more student ready so that we can better serve those students who might be more disproportionately impacted by biases. So let's start off by really unpacking what it means to be a student-ready college. So this definition comes from the book that was on one of our earlier slides about being student-ready, and it's a very general definition. So a student-ready college is one that strategically and holistically advances student success and works tirelessly to educate all students for civic and economic participation in a global interconnected society. But if we really dig into why this is using the very specific term student ready, it's really about looking at a shifting mindset. When we talk about student success, a lot of the themes that we use and a lot of the things that we address have to do with the students' preparedness. So how prepared are students when they get to college? What are those pre-college factors that set them up for being successful? In order to really start moving towards becoming student ready, you have to shift your mindset away from that and start thinking about what do we need to do to prepare for the students that actually come to our institution? What are the students' expectations about their experience in education? The key to being student ready is being able to very intentionally link your institution's mission to the student's expectation. You have to have alignment between those things so that as you design programming, as you make resources available, and as you support students that might struggle in their process to be successful, you understand a little bit better about how to meet them where they are. And you'll hear, you heard Dr. Howard say that a lot, you'll hear me say that a lot, but that is the key component of becoming student ready. It really is a mind shift instead of saying, okay, these are all the things we need to do to prepare students to get them so that they are ready for us. What are the things that we're doing to be ready for them, however they come to the door with whatever skill sets and expectations they have when they arrive? So how does bias impact being student ready? So there are three key things, two of which we've already talked about in the earlier portions of this presentation. But those two key things, deficit mindset and implicit bias, are really barriers to setting up a student-ready college. So the first one, though, is a little bit of a new concept that the book digs into, this idea of academic capitalism. And academic capitalism is the idea that when you look at academia, the decision-making that happens is driven by market or market-like resources and information. So if you think about the United States in terms of how we govern ourselves and a lot of the factors that we use to make decisions, it's really driven by the fact that we have this very market-driven capitalist economy. And those economic decisions actually have started to impact the way that decisions are made in academia. And how that impacts the educational experience and the overall experience to students actually has changed institutions' ability to become student ready, because you're responding more to those economic factors than you are to the students as a key stakeholder at your institution. We talked a lot already about deficit mindset, but in the context of being student ready, as Dr. Howard said, you're really looking at what students don't have. So you're, instead of having the strength-based approach, you're spending a lot of time focusing on missing skills, using those as an explanation to why students aren't successful. And this happens a lot when you might identify a group of students who aren't persisting or graduating at the same rates in your data. One of the first things that we look at are things like, what were their high school GPA? What were those admissions test scores? Looking at that academic achievement that happened prior to the student getting there. Finally, implicit bias is a thing that we're going to talk about more as it relates to data and being student ready, because we know, as I said earlier, that that linkage between the institutional mission and what the student's expectations are is a key component to becoming student ready. So if you have stereotypes that are impacting what you think the student's expectations are or how you view your own mission, it makes it very difficult to connect those two things. And one thing I really want to point out that's important is that these biases can go both ways. You can be biased towards thinking about someone positively or biased towards thinking about someone negatively. We often focus on the negative implications of bias, but implicit bias is also a direct factor in giving people privilege, and it impacts our ability to serve students. A great example of that is when a lot of institutions dig into data that look at their high achieving students, and will define high achieving in this case as students who come in with very high standardized test scores and very high school GPAs. It's not unusual for institutions to identify that there is a lag in persistence once you hit a certain plateau in test score. So you actually have students who have extremely high test scores who don't persist at high rates, when a lot of us have assumptions that there's sort of this direct line, and the higher the test score and the higher the high school GPA, the more likely that student is to persist. A lot of people don't even look at the data and the experiences of their high achieving students, and that often becomes a group that has unmet needs, because there's an assumption, oh, if you come in with these great test scores and all of these AP classes and all these IB classes, then you're ready to go and there are no barriers to your success. So we've actually negatively impacted those students' experiences because we weren't ready to support them based on their needs and what they were actually indicating through their behavior. So what role does data play in this? We know that higher education institutions, no matter their size or type, are very data rich. We collect lots of information on our students, how they apply, how they engage with us, the emails they send, their academic performance in classes. And we use that information. We use it in a lot of different ways. But data can help us and it can also harm us. So I'm really, really fascinated to dig into the different ways that institutions use data. This screenshot, this picture that's on this slide here, is about a institution that was using data, that attempted to use data to address a retention issue for its freshman students. And in this particular situation, this is an article, and there are several articles about this in the Chronicle of Higher Education, that is really a case study for how the intentions of how you use data can actually not turn out in the way that you want it to based on your initial outcomes. And a lot of that has to do with those unconscious biases that happen during the data process. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this particular situation, this institution was Mount St. Mary University. In 2015, the president, who was relatively new, was advocating a new plan to use data to be able to identify a percentage of freshmen who were coming in who were less likely to persist. There was a very specific goal coming from their board of trustees to increase persistence. So they developed a survey that they gave to students, at the orientation and in that first week of classes with the assistance of faculty, targeted towards we need to improve our retention rate. That was the context that this survey was developed. They gave the survey to students, they collected that, they processed it, and through the processing of that data, they identified 20 to 25 students who were less likely to succeed based on the responses to those questions. Now, after those students were identified, the communications that happened internally within that institution, basically instead of focusing on, okay, now that we've identified these students, how do we help these students persist? It was by recommending that these students withdraw before the census date, we will improve our institutional retention. Some of the language that was used to talk about these students and how they were identified as less likely to succeed were phrases like, we should just drown the bunnies, meaning that let's just put students out of their misery because we already know that they're not going to be successful. I think another phrase that was used in the email was to go ahead and put a Glock to their head. Again, an analogy saying, let's put them out of their misery because we already know they're not going to be successful. So, of course, these emails that got out to faculty caused a lot of distress. And there was a lot of cognitive dissonance between the way that the initial plan was described from the president, which was we're developing this survey to collect data to figure out who needs assistance. It became clear that the purpose of collecting the data was just to identify students who instead you wanted to unenroll. So in this case, there was a lot of unconscious bias there. And then there was a lot of assumptions that were being made that once those students were identified as less likely to succeed, that meant that they were less likely to succeed, instead of using that information to start thinking about, okay, what can we do to support these students? So these questions are questions to really think about as we go through these next slides, to talk about those very specific examples of how data show up, or how bias shows up in data. So what kind of assumptions do you make when you see how students are showing up in your data? What information shows up in the data? Are you using that to just have a confirmation bias? So you already know that these students aren't going to succeed. So when you see on there, oh, we have this group of Black men who have lower test scores, that obviously shows me that they can't be successful in college. Are you using those assumptions in that way? What kind of services do you provide for your students? Again, back to that example of honor students. Do you assume that your honor students don't need your tutoring services? Your high achieving students don't need the academic support services? Or do you actually know what the students need when they show up, based on the programs that they enroll in and the number of classes they choose to take? How are you using that data? And then what are your missed opportunities to make sure that there are services that are available for your students as a collective population, because you're making assumptions that only those services are valid or useful for a small group of students? So I love this cartoon. I love Dilbert. I'm a little bit of a data nerd. So Dilbert cartoons are great for talking about technology and data. And one of the things that is essential in moving towards the application of data and using it to help yourself become more student ready is to challenge your mindset about data. Now, in this particular cartoon strip, you have Dilbert's boss talking about how consultants came in and have identified this great thing called big data. It lives everywhere. It knows everything. And even though everything else is bad, if we just use the big data, then we will be saved. And we will pay any dollar amount to get our hands on this big data. And so I think when we start talking about using data, to help us serve our students better, whether it is reports that you create yourself, whether you're looking at purchasing technology that has analytics or coaching or degree planning tools, or any or all of the customer relations management tools, any of those that collects all this data on students. We think if we have this information, then that's all we need and we can solve all of our problems. But there's a big difference between being data-driven and data-informed. And when you go into thinking about using data, particularly if you're trying to address big problems like biases in your institution, you really should have a mindset that the data is there to inform you and not drive you. So first off, when you use the term or you conceptualize things in terms of being data driven, that means that the data has a disproportionate amount of power in driving the decisions. And one of the things that we will talk about a little bit more is why that can be dangerous and how that can actually help to perpetuate biases. Data and analytics is not a panacea. You can't believe that the introduction of data or any sort of analysis will give you all the answers. One of the things that I say very often when I'm in meetings, when we're introducing new data sets or we're introducing new analyses, is that any sort of data that I get, I always tell people, this data doesn't answer your question. It just helps you to ask better questions. So it's not about the answers. It's about using it as a part of the overall process to make decisions about your students and how you support them. And so that's that difference between being data informed and being data driven. So to dig in a little bit more about bias and data informed decision making, I'm going to break down 4 different ways that we see bias show up in our data informed decision making. That first one is being biased against data or certain types of data. The second is using data to support biased ideas or decisions. The third is being biased against who can or should have access to data. And then finally, we'll wrap it up with really looking at how bias actually lives within the data that we collect and use. So the first one thing that you hear a lot when we talk about student success in higher education is that people really want to solve academic issues using academic data. Sometimes that might be intentional, and sometimes it's about what you have easy access to. Easy to get your hands on, because those are things that we have to store anyway. We have to keep track of grades. We have to keep track of GPA. We keep track of retention rates and graduation rates because we report those to lots of external partners. So it's very easy for us to say, okay, let's look at those data sets. Let's look at those data points and use that to solve any issues or problems that we see in the support of our students. But the reality is that we really should be thinking about things like qualitative data and not just quantitative data. Do you use focus groups? Do you have interviews with your students, with your faculty, with your student services people to understand what the expectations are and what the conditions are in which students engage with different offices, with different programs? Do we do observations of our environment or spaces? There's great participant and non-participant observational techniques that help you to see how are people engaging in spaces? How are they interacting or not interacting? What spaces do they use or not use? And then just the collection of artifacts like pamphlets or posters, websites, handouts, forms, directions, all of those things help you to see what kind of information you're providing to students, how are students using those, how do they process those, and in conjunction with that quantitative data can tell you a lot about how your students are experiencing things. The bias that we have towards using academic data is really an overall bias about cognitive versus non-cognitive data. This happens a lot in higher education. It also happens a lot in student services. You see cognitive data are things that are much easier to measure. things like thinking and reasoning and remembering, reading comprehension, quantitative reasoning, things that are very easy to create those data points on so you can collect lots of data about them. Non-cognitive areas or things like soft skills or social emotional skills are a lot harder to measure, but we do know that there are different ways of doing that and lots of great tools out there that have been developed over the years, over the decades that we already use, but we don't always think about how we can apply the data that we get from those. Things like the college student inventory, the beginning college survey of student engagement is another tool. Things like the grit assessments that were developed. How do we use that information? A great example I can share with you from the University of South Florida here is our Office of New Student Connections. That office works with our students that are enrolled in their first year, primarily those freshmen. And instead of just looking at academic data that shows us things like their high school GPA or their test score, we have all of our students take the beginning college survey of student engagement during the orientation process that collects a lot of non-cognitive data. It asks them questions like, how much do you plan on studying? Do you have a friend here? Was the University of South Florida your first choice? And then we pull out those specific questions. There are 7 specific questions that we use to identify if students have said that they don't have expectations to have strong study skills, or they don't have expectations to have strong peer support groups. And we use our peer coaching program, our peer advisor leaders that we call PALs, to reach out to those students before the semester even begins to start addressing those non-cognitive issues that might impact their ability to onboard successfully. It's one of our more successful retention strategies that continue to help us improve not only our retention rate, but our retention rate for freshmen who have GPAs over 2.0 as well. When we look at bias number 2, we automatically assume that if we do an analysis or we do data, that we're going to uncover issues. And that's why you do data analysis or why you set up those kind of analyses. So when we think about a lot of commonly used analysis, we think about things like those persistence scores. We want to look and see who are the students who are leaving, or who are the students that are not graduating. Let's take a look at them. A really common data set that institutions look at are the DFW rates. What are the courses that students are getting Ds and Fs in? What are the students that they withdraw from at disproportionately high rates? We also might look at students who aren't earning enough credit hours, or students who have a GPA below a 2.0. One of the things that Dr. Howard mentioned is that we should really start thinking about a strengths-based approach. This is a really, really central component of setting up a student-ready college. And this also applies to our use of data. Instead of just pulling data sets that look at the students who aren't successful, or who look at, or those data sets that look at negative behaviors like failure rates, what kind of data do we look at that helps us to identify what are the strategies that students who are successful are doing, and then are those strategies that are equally accessible to all students? A great example of this are the curricular pathways that students take throughout their degree program. There's a concept called the shadow curriculum that disproportionately affects Black students and Hispanic students because they don't have the social capital to develop relationships with faculty to get these prioritized spaces and courses and these optimized curricular pathways that increase their likelihood of being successful. So what that means is we often have degree plans that we hand to students that say, here are the 120 credit hours that you need to graduate. And when you look at those plans, oftentimes there's a lot of choice within them. There are some curriculums in engineering or nursing that might be very prescriptive, but you might look at a curriculum like psychology and it'll have 24 credit hours of electives. What are those electives that students need to take? You have some students who might just take courses based on what's interesting to them, or advice that they might get from a parent or a sibling who has been through the college experience. Then you have other students that don't have those social groups, who don't have those peer groups, who don't have faculty members or staff members that they feel comfortable developing those type of advising or coaching or mentoring relationships with. And so if that psychology undergraduate student indicates an intent to go to medical school or to get into speech pathology, there are specific electives that they should be taking that will optimize the experience in their program and make them more likely to be successful. But those students without that social capital will be less likely, those students without the social capital are less likely to know what those options are, and therefore their experience is different than those students who know, if I take this course, it's going to help me to reach my goal. Another example of a different mindset is looking at engagement with our high impact practices. I'm sure you've heard that term before, but high impact practices are things like undergraduate research or study abroad. There are things like building up portfolios or engaging in ethnic, cultural, and global experiences. The research on engagement in high impact practices shows us that students of color and students from lower socioeconomic groups actually engage in high impact practice at lower rates. So why does that happen? How do we dig into the data to understand, is it because students don't know about these options? We're not providing enough specific types of fiduciary incentives that open up those pathways to students? There could be a lot of reasons for that, but do we actually take the time to dig in and know what those things are? So looking at a very specific example here shared on the slide, thinking about why do students succeed versus why do students fail, I've got two different sets of data points to really think about how you might be able to evaluate the retention of underrepresented minority students. So a fixed mindset is going to immediately go, again, to those quantitative, easily accessible data points. Things like high school GPA, test scores, GPAs in the first term, grades that the students earn in gateway English and math classes in their first year of enrollment, and make an assessment of how to intervene and support those students. Someone who's looking at their data set from a growth mindset is going to consider exploring other data sources, some of which might actually be more non-cognitive in nature. So instead of just looking at that first semester GPA, look at the course selection. What courses were the students taking in combination together? Look at their access to advising and tutoring. Do you see how often those students engage in student support services? How many times they visit? Do they have assigned advisors, or is advising not required for them? So they don't know that they can go in and make use of those resources. And then what are you doing to develop academic peer groups for those students? What exists? How do they exist? And how do students access them? Lots of different ways that you can start looking at different levers that you can pull to actually start setting yourself up comprehensively as an institution to become student ready. So when we look at bias number 3, we often think about data as something that needs to be protected, something that needs to be secure. And because of that, you hear a lot of conversations about who needs to have access to data. Data is for those decision makers. So take a minute and think to yourself, who gets the data at your institution? Is that something that you get on a daily basis? Is it something that you only see in senior leadership? Are there types of data that your frontline staff have access to in order to understand or serve students? Really understanding how the bias towards only given data to decision makers is really important. The main key point that I can make here that is a very important assumption is that all stakeholders in the higher education system are decision makers. Even though you're not a president or a provost or a dean or even a director, if you work in an environment where you are providing services or making decisions about services to students, you make decisions on a daily, weekly, monthly, semester basis that impacts the experience of that student. So there are ways that you can provide data to any level of staff to help them think about how to become student ready themselves. Another really important barrier is that we often don't empower students with their own data. We want to collect information on their academic performance, their engagement, but then we don't believe that they have the skills or the aptitude or the willingness to look at their own data to be able to help make their own decisions about what courses to take, how many to take, when to take them, and the other hundreds of decisions that we ask them to make as students to be successful. So again, I want to kind of look through this different scenario to give you an example of what it means to think about empowering every level of stakeholder with some form of data and stepping away from our biases that a decision maker equals senior leadership. So let's go back to this scenario that I keep bringing up, and that's our high achieving students. You might call them high achieving, you might have an honors program, but those students, and seeing, you know what, we're not retaining as many of those students as the general population. So you might have a question that comes from the president or a provost or a campus director or a dean that says, you know, we have these high achieving students, but they're not staying with us. We need to look and understand. I want to improve that. Let's track the retention rates for this population of students. When you talk to faculty and instructors, they might look at it and hear that question and hear that issue and say, you know what, I want to look at academic data. We actually have a system that allows us to teach online. So I really want to see how they experience the online environment. So maybe that's looking actually at academic data in the LMS to see how many times they log in, how long they log in, do they watch the videos, how many discussion boards do they complete? Or on the flip side, if you don't have that kind of LMS data, digging in and looking at what kind of classes they take. From a staff level that's maybe not in the classroom and are in non-academic spaces, you might start thinking about, where do the honors students go when they're not in class? What services do they use? What spaces do they use? And start looking at the data that you collect over the course of providing your services or monitoring your spaces to see, do the students come into these spaces? Because we know if they use these services, we are increasing their likelihood of success. And then finally, you might have students who have always been high achieving, who have always made great grades and have never struggled in school, who come to a different environment with different instructors, with different levels of support and think, you know, I've always gotten A's and I sat in this very first class and I don't know what's going on and I don't actually know where to go to help, where to ask for help. What kind of information can you give that student about their own performance that helps prompt them and inform them so they, again, can also be a part of the data-informed decision-making process about their own student experience. So even though each one of those stakeholder groups were addressing the same question and the same problem, they were all looking at different sources of data, whether it's cognitive or non-cognitive data, to try to answer those questions. So finally, we have our last bias, and that's bias 4. And this is a huge one. You hear this a lot, particularly as it relates to quantitative data. That bias is that data is neutral. If we go back to our little Dilbert cartoon where our boss was really excited when he heard about this great thing called big data, we believe we get our hands on these huge data sets and we create these complex data analysis, and that can help us address our biases and solve our problems because data is just numbers. It's neutral and it doesn't reflect our personal biases if we just ask someone's opinion. So we think, if I go and talk to a faculty member and I say, why aren't we retaining students? Why aren't these students persisting? Their own natural prejudice, those unconscious biases, their implicit biases that we talked about throughout this presentation are going to come out in how they articulate what they think is going on with the student population. But statistics removes all subjectivity from decision making because you're not asking anyone's opinion, you're just looking at what the numbers say. But what we have to remember when it comes to quantitative data is that data is going to reflect the biases of the people who collected the data, the people who performed the analysis on the data, the people who applied the results of that analysis, and then most importantly, the structures, the process, and the policies that were in place at the time that the data was collected. Think back to the case study that I shared at the beginning of my section about Mount St. Mary's and our beleaguered president. The process for collecting the data was communicated with the intent of supporting students for the retention, but the application of the results, which was steered by the president, was instead to have those students withdraw before census. So his own biases about looking at the data that indicated that those students were less likely to be successful impacted how that data was used, and then the subsequent impact on those students and their experience at the institution. So data itself is not neutral, even when you use quantitative data and quantitative analysis. So let's get into another specific example about how this bias can manifest in quantitative data. Now, it is no secret that there are current and ongoing issues related to policing in the United States. A common practice in a lot of large urban police departments is the use of predictive policing, which is the use of data that comes from historical arrest patterns to be able to identify in advance areas that might see higher levels of crime, particularly violent crime. You saw a lot of areas like Los Angeles and Philadelphia, Chicago, using these predictive policing systems. And ironically, they were developed using geological patterns that track earthquakes and tsunamis to be able to see the buildup of factors that might lead to conditions that would result in higher levels of violent crime. Now, when researchers actually started to break down how these predictive policing models were actually implemented, what they found was instead of being able to reveal new patterns of violent crime that happened in communities, they used that historical data to show patterns of where police were more likely to collect information on violent crime. So what that means is in Los Angeles, where you had higher levels of targeted policing in Black communities, that there was more data on crime in Black communities. So the predictive models actually showed higher likelihoods of future violent crime in those communities. That was based on literally the volume of information and the policing policies that were in place in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s when that data was collected that created bias that showed higher levels of activity. So when you look at these two pictures that are on the slide, the one on the right that shows the map is actually showing red blocks that shows the number of targeted police areas based on the predictive policing model. So the darker the red block shows higher levels of targeted, basically what they would do was have higher levels of police presence in those communities that have those darker red blocks, because the model was showing that there was a higher likelihood that there would be drug-related crimes in those communities. When the researchers took a look at that data to compare that to communities where there was actual drug use, you can take a look at the bar charts and see that even though you had higher levels of targeted policing in the Black communities, that's that middle bar that's higher than both the white communities and other communities, you basically have an equitable amount of drug use by race across white, Black, and other communities. But again, because there was more data that indicated the levels of drug-related crimes in Black communities were higher, the system predisposed to the biases based on policing policies said that there was a higher likelihood of future events happening in those same communities. So even though that was totally statistical, you didn't have police officers or police chiefs or sergeants making decisions about where to police, we still ended up replicating those same practices by the use of data. This is a really important point when thinking about how to not only better use quantitative data, but how we want to move forward in the use of data to become a student-ready college. So what are the structural components that we can put into place to protect against bias in data? So there are really two key points that are important to think about to protect against the bias that exists in data. The first is data governance. So what is data governance? Data governance is the idea that you have to have inclusive conversations about who uses what data and why they use that data. I want to refer back to Dr. Howard's exercise on examining your circle of trust. That is a very important exercise to think about and to use when you think about creating systems of data governance. Those people who are allowed to sit at the table and make decisions about what kinds of data you use and for what purposes may be only those individuals that are in your circle of trust. And if that circle is homogeneous, that doesn't represent not only all of the students and all of the students' needs within your community, but it also might lend itself to you missing opportunities to serve your students. So asking that data governance group, things like whose data will be used, who will be involved in the analysis, who will be applying that analysis, how will you be using those results? Those are the type of questions that you need that diverse, unique perspectives to ensure that not only are you using the right kind of data to avoid things like having data that have that baked in biases, but then also that you're not setting up questions or problems based on your own unconscious biases. So the second piece, data literacy, is really thinking about what sort of knowledge do you need to have to be able to use data. This is focused on ensuring that you have accuracy and relevance when you apply any sort of results or information that you get for a data set. One of the things that I didn't talk about in biases, but really does kind of relate to our own personal biases about what it means to use data, is that a lot of times when we think about setting up systems where we use data to help students or to address problems, we think this is a conversation only for the data scientists because they're the ones that have that high level of data literacy. So you might have a room that's disproportionately filled with your institutional research or institutional effectiveness team, or perhaps your information technology staff to look at how your student information systems are collecting information. But data literacy is not just about having technical understanding of the data, it's about understanding the context of the question. And in the context of a student-ready institution, that context is who knows the students. And so obviously, we should start thinking about how do we include students in the conversation, because they have an understanding about what their expectation is and about what their experience is at our institution. It's about having frontline staff who are the people who provide the service in the conversation, because they understand the context of why a student might choose to come in their office or not come into their office. So don't make those assumptions that data literacy is just about, someone who is a research scientist or someone who creates those institutional reports that go off to the National Student Clearinghouse or IPEDS. I myself have no technical background in IT or in data analysis. However, this is a space that I work in a lot, as my title suggests, with advising and analytics. I refer to myself as a funky tech, which means I'm a functional and a technical person, which I spend a lot of my time making connections between technical pieces like analyses and our technology systems with our functional areas that provide services to students. And so even though I may not be able to hop into a system like SAS or Tableau or Power BI and build a dashboard that shows different trends in the data, I do have an understanding about what kind of information we collect and what we might want to see and who we might need to put at the table to have a conversation about an analysis. And that is a really important piece to setting up structural components within your institution that allow you to use data in a way that focuses on student success and meeting the students where they are, instead of allowing those baked-in biases that come from the structures and the processes and the systems that we have set up and become barriers to the level of impact that the data can actually have for us. Sorry, I went one slide too far there. So to wrap up, before we actually dig in and open up for conversations and questions, we want to spend a little bit of time and talk about taking action at home. So we've given you a lot of different information that kind of falls into these two buckets about thinking about biases and deficit mindset and transformational learning experiences, as well as thinking about how you use data as it relates to our one overall take action at home. So I'm going to start and give a couple of suggestions. And then I'm going to hand it back to my colleague, Dr. Howard, so she can tell you a little bit about those key components of taking action at home to do the type of reflection and assessment and long-term learning process to start addressing your personal and your institutional biases. So what does it mean to take action at home? When you're thinking about using data to address your biases and to start laying the groundwork to become a student-ready institution. You really have to be thinking about that data governance structure. That's a key component. So in item number 3 there, when you're thinking about how you're guiding your institution, the people, the processes, and the system, the data becomes a key part of setting up the informational systems to support the decisioning on each one of those areas. It's also important to think about in the early stages when you're identifying your biases and how those biases present, to have that information ready to discuss and talk about when you're building your governance and when you're doing your analysis. Remember, awareness is the first and the most important step to start making progress towards addressing biases. And that even counts when you're doing that, that transformational learning experience by using data. And so the data literacy piece, a lot of the learning experience that comes from pulling this data and sharing this data needs to be an iterative cycle. So you need to be able to consistently and constantly learn. Just like the point I made earlier, when you pull this data and you look at it and you collect that information, the data is not there to answer your questions or to solve your problems. It's to help you ask yourself better questions and to ask each other better questions and give yourself the ability to use your own expertise to continue to solve your problems. And so now I will take a beat and hand it over to Dr. Howard to let her wrap us up.
Okay, good to see you again, and thank you for staying with us. So just a couple of things as you are on your taking action home. If you haven't done so already, I strongly encourage you just to take a quick snapshot of the screen, whether it's on your camera or with your computer. And just remember that this work, it doesn't happen overnight, but the planning and putting the pieces in place don't take much time. And as long as you are dedicated to this activity, it can be done. It's not impossible. And you are able to identify wins along the way. So just a couple of things that I want you to keep in mind when it comes to identifying your institutional biases and your inequities, which impact you to become, preventing you from becoming a student-ready campus. Remember, this starts at home. And when I say it starts at home, we are institutions comprised of people and individuals. So that means that we bring our own biases, our implicit, our unconscious, all of those things we bring to the table. So it starts at home with putting up a mirror in front of ourselves. We really have to take a look at our institutions. And across the board, I like to remind people of these three things, IPP. You want to be intentional, you want to be purposeful, and you want to be proactive. So that means that you have to have some hard conversations, not only with yourself, but then also with the people that you have around the table. Because who created the policies that lead to the inequities? Who created the structures that lead to inequities that privilege some? So you want to make sure that you're doing that homework. It's very, very important. And then, of course, for number two, when you're describing how those biases present in the different areas, such as mindset, initiatives, informations, and structures, I really ask you that all of these are important, but that you add a bit more focus, perhaps, on that mindset and on those structures. Because if you get those aligned correctly, the initiatives that come out of a growth mindset and the initiatives that come out of structures and policies that are built so those can have the greatest amount of opportunity and minimize inequities, by default, you're going to have initiatives and programs that are just the same. So keep in mind the structures and the mindsets, knowing that all of them are important. But if I have a place where I'd like you to start, it would be on structure and mindset. And then just remember with number three, how would you guide the institution in addressing each of the areas within the scope? It also goes back to the circle of trust once again, as Dr. Irvin reiterated as well. That's a very important piece. That means that we have to step outside of our comfort zone. We have to build bridges with those that we may not initially think of as allies, but it's important to have the diverse voices around the table, and also to have the people that it's going to impact at the table and have them represented and represented well. It's generally an afterthought, if at all, that we have students a part of this process. That is not going to get you to where you need to be a student-ready campus. It is very important to have students at the table. And I don't just mean your president of your a student association, because we tap them all the time. I mean tapping the students that are representative. If you happen to have remedial courses, you need to have students that are in remedial courses at the table. If you have honors programs, you need to have students that are in honors programs at the table. So from the wide range, we have to just stop tapping the ones that we tend to say, oh, well, you know, so-and-so, they're really involved. That's not enough to get you to where you need to be to really close this achievement gap to ensure that all of our students are meeting their potential. So with that, we will conclude and take a look at some of the questions. I'm just trying to shift it so I can figure out how we. Okay. So let's see. What do we have here? Want to start with that one?
So I definitely, I see that there is an ask in the chat about getting access to the PowerPoint and the notes, and we'll make sure that those are provided to the session moderators so they can be distributed. And I'll also make sure that I put the slide back up that has our email addresses so you can contact us by email as well to be able to follow up with any additional questions that you might have. Let's see. Has the office been open long enough to collect any data on any particular things that affect persistence, like friends on campus? So I think this question is about the New Student Connection office, and I can tell you a little bit more about the process that they use when they look at that non-cognitive data. So they actually use the information from the Beginning College Survey of Student Engagement, and they look at very specific questions. So they actually do look at a question. There's a question on the Bessie that specifically asks if the students have a friend on campus already. So they look at how difficult do you expect it to be at the University of South Florida. They look at, do you expect to graduate from the University of South Florida? They look at a question where they ask, are you bringing any friends with you? And so they specifically reach out and use those peer advisor leaders, the PALs, to make contact with the students, to encourage them to use specific services, to give them some coaching on specific behaviors to help them onboard more effectively. And when they look at the data from the contacts from our PALs, they can see that two different things. Students who get earlier contact, which is one of the reasons why we started contacting students before they even started, as well as students who have 3 or more contacts from a PAL, show gains in persistence. So a lot of the development of the peer advisor leader training program that the students go through when they become PALs are geared towards these very beneficial coaching exercises around each one of these questions based on what the students respond. So that office has had a lot of success. They continue to develop different types of coaching conversations around different things. So there's a lot of benefit to that use of the non-cognitive data. I'm trying to figure out how to scroll up there. There we go. So we've got a question that says, any hypothesis about why students with high GPAs test scores lack persistence and what supports build their ability to persist? So I'll hand off to Dr. Howard if she has anything to add. One of the things I would really advise is you do have to look at your own students. So one of the things that's important and key in becoming a student-ready college is understanding how those students experience your particular environment and how they experience and utilize your specific services. So we always will have a foundation that comes from the data and the research done by others, but how students experience your campus or your services is really key. But one of the things we know about students who come in who are placed into a bucket as being high achieving students is that we see a lot of times that they severely underutilize services because they don't know how to engage with youth services because they don't have experience for that. So it's the development of help-seeking behaviors. You also have high levels of anxiety. So exploring health and wellness issues is also really important for those students because oftentimes they haven't developed, again, the skill set to deal with not being successful and to be self-directed as they troubleshoot. So particularly with newer types of problems, I can't say it enough, but really digging into non-cognitive data can help you to understand some of the students' decision-making and why they make the decisions that they make. Anything you want to add?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Urban. Another thing that the research has shown us, in addition to what Dr. Urban has talked about, is that for the students that we have deemed high achieving based on some of the references that you mentioned there, I believe it was Danny, is that for many of the students, and I can't emphasize enough, we do want to make sure we benchmark at the literature and find out what's going on at our own institutions, but the literature does tell us that we're not meeting the needs of many of these students. They come in as freshmen and they're ready to begin research with faculty, they're ready to study abroad, they're ready to get engaged in career and internships, and oftentimes our campuses are not set up and ready for freshmen to start that work, and they're not willing to wait. So they'll often transfer out and find other institutions that are able to meet those needs, or they'll go straight into industry as well. So we just want to be careful about making sure that we're meeting the needs of the students in conjunction with the areas that Dr. Urban has talked about. But those two things, the literature has shown us that we are not doing a great job with the students who fit in that bucket. What else do we have?
I'm not seeing any other questions. Anybody else have any questions or even just comments that you want to add or share? Thoughts that you may have had specifically about any points or ideas or suggestions that we shared that you'd like to share? Add the PowerPoint to the chat. Yes, I can. We did have some technical difficulties getting on, so I don't want to fully commit that I'll be able to drop it in the chat, but I fully commit to making an attempt to dropping it in the chat so that you can get access to that as well. Any other questions or points or observations that you made? Hopefully there were some opportunities to do some self-reflection about your own processes and pathways as it relates to those spaces where you might see bias cropping up in your own work. And one of the points I think we both made that I'll bring up again, since we still have a couple of more minutes before we end, is that it's really important to think about how bias comes into a play, not just negatively or positively. If you can assess the ways in which your institutional biases might privilege students to have access to different services or resources or people are very, very important resources in the world of student success. So if there's something about your institutional processes or policies that make certain faculty members more difficult to access for your Black students or your Hispanic students or your students who come in who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, or our housing insecure or food insecure students. Those type of barriers and the way that we might make assumptions about what students are able to access are really important. Just thinking about how we've all had to make adjustments in the way that we do our work in COVID talks a lot about the privilege of higher education, how we sort of default from this position of assuming that it would be very easy for everyone to transition to being online,
right,
and no thought to not just how students might access the hardware, like laptop computers or cameras or microphones or headsets, but literally, do students have appropriate study spaces to positively and effectively engage in the classroom and study habits, is an assumption that we all made, and that we all made very quickly. As Dr. Howard mentioned, because those decisions had to be made quickly, we allowed those unconscious bias, the implicit bias we have about what it means to be a student, to drive some of the decision making. So I think I see another question up in the chat. What are resources our departments can use to help with data literacy and getting started with collecting data from students about the efficacy of our services, getting started with questions and best methods to use? So there are so many different spaces to start with that. I think when it comes to data literacy, it really is about the type of data that you're going to start using. So start with thinking about, do you want to use quantitative or qualitative data? If you're looking at starting with qualitative data, a space where people start really quickly in and think that it's going to be easy is focus groups, because you're like, I'm going to have a focus group of students. Let's get 5 or 6 students together. We ask them some questions, and then we'll get some insights. There's actually a lot of research around how to build effective focus groups and the type of questions that you should ask them. If you don't have any data about student success and about being student ready, and you want to look at how students engage with your services, instead of thinking about collecting quantitative data, I would really encourage you to start with focus groups, and then use those focus groups to hone in on the type of quantitative data that you'd want to select. And that's a way that you can both start collecting data that you don't have about the use of services, but then also you're starting to indirectly involve the students in the data governance process, because you're using the information that they've provided to you to start laying the groundwork on what kind of quantitative data that you want to collect that helps you to understand how or why or when they're engaging with your services. Anything you want to add about that?
I would agree. And just to emphasize, to utilize the resources that you have. We all are at institutions of higher learning with various areas of expertise. So you'd be surprised how many people do have that knowledge. I'm a qualitative researcher myself, and it is important to make sure you're following kind of the rules and regulations of appropriately going forth with qualitative research, so it can guide the quantitative data that you're trying to get. But I can't emphasize enough to just utilize the resources that you have. And it never hurts just to ask. Oftentimes we don't realize what other units are doing and what data they're collecting anyway. So that's a good place to start too, is just kind of a fishnet out to everyone. You know, can you get back to me with what type of data you're collecting, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, and how you're going about doing it, just to start from somewhere, because I can guarantee you every single person here that's representing an institution, there's a unit you don't know about that's collecting data. And then also ask the students. A lot of student organizations, believe it or not, they do an excellent job of getting information about each other. So that would be my recommendation.
Yeah, that's great. I totally agree. That's so true. We sort of unintentionally collect lots of data in lots of different spaces, and we don't always know what to do with it, but we're usually collecting it in some space somewhere by someone.
Yeah.
And also this session and this conference was put on by your state organization, your state governing board, and there may be some different options within the state governing board to consider and discuss and to find out what type of reporting happens on an institutional basis with different things with students that you can start looking at and using different ways. So there might be just some standard institutional reporting that already happens too that can be repurposed. So yeah, I think we're at our time. It looks like 4:15, and we put our emails in the chat. I will also attempt to post the PowerPoint presentation in the chat as well. We appreciate everybody who took the time to sign in. Thanks so much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you. Have a good day.